Session 3 will now begin. First, Mr. Miyazono Masataka, President of Government Pension Investment Fund, will give a keynote speech.
年金積立金管理運用独立
Hello, I am Masataka Miyazono, the President of the Government Pension Investment Fund, GPIF. I am very grateful for the opportunity to speak at the GGX Finance Summit 2024. I must apologize that I cannot join you at the venue, even though the event itself is taking place face-to-face. This summer was very hot, and with the arrival of large typhoons, the transportation network and logistics were disrupted. And I think many people feel that climate change is not a future issue, but the one that needs to be addressed now. In recent years, climate change is increasingly viewed as a challenge that needs to be taken into account of in investment, and such view is already established. The GPIF has been entrusted with nearly 250 trillion yen in pension reserves from the Japanese people and invest in a wide range of domestic and international capital markets. The climate change risks occur simultaneously across all asset classes and issues, so even with diversified investment, it is impossible to completely eliminate them. In addition, as the risk is considered to be extremely likely to become more apparent in the long run, the GPIF has been taking various measures. Specifically, in September 2018, we began investing based on carbon efficient index, which is designed to reflect greenhouse gas emission divided by annual revenues of a company. And in December of the same year, we announced the support for TCFD. From 2019, we do climate-related financial disclosures in line with the TCFD recommendations every year. We have also invested in GX Economic Transition Bond, which will be discussed in the sessions today. In the ESG Report 2023 that we recently published, in addition to introducing our past ESG activities, GPIF has also conducted various analyses related to climate change and natural capital risk. The details of the analysis are posted on the GPIF website, so please visit and have a look. Today, I would like to pick one of the analyses from this report. In the previous ESG activity report, we analyzed disclosure of impact, including green bonds and other instruments. But this time, we have expanded on this analysis to look at the relationship between the premium on green bond or greenium and third-party certification, information disclosure, and impact, respectively. By issuing green bonds, which are more labor and cost-intensive than regular bonds, issuers can expect to see some secondary benefits, such as an improvement in their corporate reputation. But I think the main reason for issuing green bonds is to be able to issue them on more favorable terms and conditions than regular bonds. It is not yet possible to make a statistically valid judgment as to whether there is greenium, as the number of samples is still limited, but it has been confirmed that greenium happens more frequently for green bonds that have undergone third-party certification and the use of funds disclosure than those that have not done so. This means the obtaining third-party certification and disclosing the use of funds improves the terms and conditions for issuance. On the other hand, it has revealed that there was a high possibility that the impact of projects financed by green bonds was not affected by greenium. To achieve green transformation, it is necessary to be able to raise funds at a lower cost for projects with greater impact. GPIF cannot do investments that disregard investment returns from the perspectives of fiduciary duty, not just for impact investments, but we will continue to consider what impact should be considered in pursuing the benefit of pension beneficiaries. From this perspective, we also hope to see improvements in the quality of impact-related information disclosure. The GPIF is actively working to expand the disclosure of ESG information, including climate-related financial information, and by raising various issues, we hope to contribute to improving the sustainability of the market on the whole. I hope that this GGX Finance Summit 2024 will lead to further revitalization of the activities of the various participants in the investment chain. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Fukutome Akihiro, Chairperson of Japanese Bankers Association, will give a keynote speech.
全国銀行協会の会長を務めております三井住友銀行の福留でございます。この度はこのような場でお話しする貴重な機会を頂戴し、誠にありがとうございます。GX の実現に向けた具体的な方策や企業と投資家、そして金融機関のエンゲージメントの基礎となる情報開示の在り方などを網羅的に議論ができる GGX ファイナンスサミットという場は大変意義深いものだと思います。我が国では昨年 GX 推進法が成立し、GX 推進戦略が取りまとめられました。今年の2月からは GX 経済移行債の発行が始まり、7月には私も発起人として参画しております GX 推進機構が業務を開始するなど、いよいよ GX に資する技術、そしてサービスをビジネスとして社会に実装していくフェーズに入りつつあると認識しています。こうした社会実装を支えるファイナンス手段の一つとして、我が国が早くから取り組んできたトランジションファイナンスは、本年の G7 でその重要性が指摘されるなど、グローバルに注目されています。引き続き我が国がリーダーシップを発揮し、普及に向けた国際的な議論を主導することが望まれます。我々銀行界の取り組み状況といたしましては、全銀協の会員行の多くがトランジションファイナンスの案件を実施、あるいは検討を進めている段階にあります。もっとも実際にお客様のトランジションをサポートしていく上では多くの課題があります。例えばお客様において技術的リスクや価格の不透明性などを背景に事業の長期的な見通しが立たず、支援する民間金融機関だけではリスクを取りきれないことがあります。この他にも金融機関ではトランジションファイナンスを推進するとポートフォリオにおける温室効果ガス排出量が一時的に増えるといった課題も認識しています。こうした課題に対応していくためには GX 推進機構の活用などを通じて官民が連携し、中長期的なリスクシェアや資金支援の最適な在り方を追求していくことや、金融機関の脱炭素に向けた取り組みを適切に評価する枠組みづくりなどが必要になります。そして何よりもお客様とお客様に連なるサプライチェーン、そして投資家や金融機関などのステークホルダーが一体となり、今まで以上にトランジションへの理解を深め、取り組みを前に進めていくことが重要であると考えています。個別校の話となり恐縮ですが、SMBC では昨年 トランジションファイナンスに関する対応方針を取りまとめたトランジションファイナンスプレイブックを公表いたしました。そして本年は対応を進めていく上での課題や案件事例などを取りまとめたトランジションファイナンススコアブックを近日公表いたします。お客様をはじめとするすべてのステークホルダーの皆様と情報を共有することで、今後のトランジションファイナンスに関する理解の進行や議論の発展に役立ててまいりたいと考えております。最後になりますが、脱炭素の実現は経済・社会の変革を伴う大きな挑戦です。本年度は GX2040 ビジョンや第7次エネルギー基本計画の策定を控えており、トランジションを含む多くの論点について議論が進展し、脱炭素化に向けた我が国の取り組みが加速していくでしょう。銀行界といたしましては、資金の供給や知見の蓄積などを通じ、お客様の脱炭素化の取り組み、ひいては経済・社会の変革などに貢献できるよう、業界を挙げて取り組んでまいります。
Thank you. Now we will move on to the panel discussion 3, Future Prospects of Transition Finance. The moderator of this session is Mr. Tajiri Takahiro, Deputy Director General for Green Transformation Policy, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. Now, I would like to ask Mr. Tajiri to moderate the session. Mr. Tajiri, please.
はい、皆様本日は
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our session. Now we would like to start panel 3, the future prospect of transition finance. As was introduced, I am Deputy Director General of the GX Policy Group at METI. My name is Tajiri. I have 3 wonderful panelists. I'm honored to be able to moderate today's session with great panelists. The theme of this panel is Future Prospect of Transition Finance. Let me briefly explain why we chose this topic at the very outset. First of all, in Japan, we have committed to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, to reduce GHG gas by 46% by 2030, compared to 2013. Turning to the eyes to around, on a GDP basis, 90% of the GHG emission represented by companies have carbon neutrality targets. To achieve this goal, we need not only to decarbonize the power sector, but also sectors such as transportation and industry. So whole of the economy decarbonization is needed to reach net zero. However, sectors include hard-to-abate industries like steel making, chemical, and cement industries do exist in our economic activities. So electrification or decarbonization of power may not be able to reduce emission from those hard-to-abate industries. So I would say 70% of the emissions are coming from those hard-to-abate industries, according to the statistics. So decarbonization of those hard-to-abate industries, we still do not have technologies changing the demand for heat or changing the manufacturing process. Those technological developments are yet to be completed, still in the processing of development. And the cost of utilization of such technologies are considered to be expensive. And therefore, solutions are not coming so easily. On the other hand, as was mentioned in the speech, financial industries may have to suffer from increase in emission in their portfolio when they are to make investment in those hard-to-abate sectors. And that may spoil their reputations in the society, and therefore financial sectors may hesitate to make investment in these sectors. So concept of transition finance or transition becomes very important as a result. Of course, those high emission industries with increased use of technology, they may be able to reduce emission, and that is needed by finance, and that is called transition finance, and Japan poses importance to such activities. For the past 4 years, various initiatives have set guidelines on climate transition finance, and discussions have been taking place. The first penguin was back in 2020. ICMA issued Climate Transition Finance Handbook. This was the first activities on setting out guidelines on climate transition finance. Since then, various groups have published documents and the guidance and booklets related to transition finance. And the Japanese government has also created tailored tools such as the guidelines and sector-specific technology roadmaps and model cases. We were certifying model cases as well. And the most recent of these efforts are for the first time as a government, issued the Japan Climate Transition Bond in February of this year. This was one of the important topics of recent times, I would say. So gradually, we see some expansion of transition finance. So based upon that, we would like to start discussion among ourselves. Today, we have 3 distinguished panelists. First, from ICMA, the Chief Representative of Asia Pacific International Capital Market, Mr. Mustache Capes, and from BNP Paribas, the Managing Director, ESG Specialist, Ms. Miriam Zapata. And lastly, but not leastly, from Financial Services Agency, the Chief Sustainable Finance Officer and Director for Strategy Development Division, Mr. Ikeda Satoshi. We have 3 panelists on the stage to engage ourselves in this discussion going forward. Now, for 3 panelists, I would like them to self-introduce, and also would like to answer to the first topic, that is the development of the transition finance discussions of the previous times.
Can you go first, followed by the Miriam and the Ikeda-san? Can you first introduce yourselves and also share your take on how the discussion around the transition has developed over these few years?
Hello. Yes, thank you very much, Tajiri-san, and very honored to be here to speak at this amazing conference with this very distinguished panel. I'm quite flattered and humbled to be in such illustrious company. So my name is Mushtaq Kapasi. I head up our operations in Asia Pacific for the International Capital Market Association. So for those of you not familiar with International Capital Market Association, or ICMA, or ICMA, we are a nonprofit trade association, and our main activities are focused on the debt capital markets. So in other words, the bond markets. And we have been active in helping to promote, formulate, and encourage best practices in the international bond markets for more than 55 years, starting in Europe and now more recently in Asia and around the world. So the core of what ICMA does is promoting best practice. What that means is that we're not necessarily a sustainability organization. We're not necessarily a green organization. We're really more of a bond organization. So it's interesting that 10 years ago, we were actually approached to help to develop and facilitate new guidance and new definitions for a very strange new product called green bonds that almost nobody had ever heard of. So ICMA took on this responsibility. That was about 10 years ago. And now you see how much farther we have gone in this journey to build a more than $5 trillion of issuance sustainable bond market. So ICMA is very honored to be a part of that. Now, this is interesting for the transition journey as well. When the green bond principles were first formulated and first designed, as many of you know, they were a use of proceeds instrument. So a green bond is defined by how the proceeds, how the money that is borrowed by the issuer of the bond is eventually used. And interestingly, back then, most of the conversations, there was general agreement that the issuer didn't matter. What was important was the use of the proceeds, was the projects, whether they are green, whether they have a positive impact on the environment, or a positive effect on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The main focus was where the proceeds are going. Now, as history went on, over the years from, say, 2014 up until about 2020, the sentiment of the market slightly changed. And it became more and more important for the issuer to be credible in its own sustainability. What I mean by that is that if you are an issuer that did not have a good sustainability policy in general, or who had no intention to change your business, to transform, to become more sustainable, and you tried to issue a green bond in the market, even if the proceeds were for a very good project, you would not have the credibility as an issuer. You would be doubted as to whether you can actively and with good faith be involved in the sustainable finance market. So this became a problem with the market, where there were many participants that were in hard to abate sectors, or difficult to abate, or maybe less easy to abate, as some of the previous panels have talked about, in sectors that are not inherently green, or issuers that were in fossil fuel sectors that wanted to invest in renewables, that wanted to promote sustainability, but who had an uphill road to climb, so to speak, an uphill road to go on, because the market would not necessarily accept that they could issue a green bond. So this was really the genesis of the transition finance guidance, and the genesis of the start of transition handbook by ICMA. The guidance from ICMA, and this has now been validated by the Japanese official sector guidance that was issued a year later, is really looking at the issuer level, the corporate, the bank, who is the company that is trying to be involved in transition finance. So the initial idea behind transition finance for ICMA was not about what is the right transition project or the right transition technology, but it's about the transition pathway for a corporate. And the idea was to give very clear guidance and very robust guidance so that an issuer of green bonds would have a very strong transition plan. The guidance required, or it suggested, I guess you could say, that an issuer that wanted to demonstrate they were committed to transition would have a very strong transition strategy that would be material to their business, that would be aligned with the Paris Agreement, definitely 2.0, but ideally as close to 1.5 degrees scenario as possible. It would be science-based. It would be extremely transparent, including CapEx, capital expenditure and operating expenditure, so really talking about where the money is going to support that plan. And then it would have to be externally verified over time. So these were some of the initial guidance that ICMA gave. And this was the reasons for the initial transition finance handbook. Now we've seen, and I'll talk about this perhaps a little bit later, that the thinking on transition finance continues to evolve. And we have most recently updated the guidance in 2023, mainly to give more detail about some of the disclosure required, in particular Scope 3 emissions, and secondly, to add additional guidance on how transition disclosure can be supported and supplemented and guided by many of the taxonomies and other official sector guidance, including the METI roadmap that have been recently issued. Thank you.
Yes, Miyama-san, please.
Hello. Great. Yes. So I guess from we can transition from guidance on best practice and recommendation on best practice to the debt capital markets. So my name is Miriam Zapata, and I am Managing Director and ESG Specialist for the public sector in debt capital markets at BNP Paribas. I'm based in London, and I'm very grateful to be here. I feel that this is a little bit part of the history of the bond market that we have up in screens there. And I guess is how we see from the debt capital markets, from the bond markets, that development that I was privileged enough to see from the very beginning. So I was there when the first green bond, the first use of proceeds green bond, trademarked by the World Bank, was issued in 2008. So it's been a little longer than 15 years since that, tiny little bond denominated in SEK currency that made the boom into the market. And since then, we can see very clear in that slide how the green, social, and sustainability bond market has exponentially grown. So that is, from that moment, even before ICMA was involved there, a market was created. A number of banks and issuers and investors got together to decide what is green finance and how we can promote the investment in green. And so I think what is interesting to understand where we are today, that part of history that I was referring to with Japan GX bond in 2024, is that every year, in the last 15 years, we have seen different milestones and landmark transactions. So from that World Bank in 2008, then, we got to see things like the first large, bond, also part of the World Bank group, this time for IFC. Then we saw the first social bond. Then we saw the first sustainability bond. We also saw, in 2016 and 17, how the sovereigns entered this market, and they provided that liquidity, that impetus that the market needed to continue growing, because investors just needed some signal that there was going to be supply for them to be able to commit to investments. And that was the role of the sovereigns at that time, 2016, 2017. It was coincidentally also around the time where the first tiny transition bond was issued, very different to what transition means today as well. And then we saw sustainability-linked bonds. Then we saw the entrance later on, as you can see, how the market continues to grow. We can see the entrance of the big, suppliers like the EU, becoming one of the big issuers of green and social bonds. The World Bank, then the sovereigns, Germany, France, and then we get to today, where we have seen how the sovereign sector takes upon itself the role of not only providing that liquidity, but also showing a different path. And this case, is the idea of transition in a different way. So back in 2017, when we saw the first tiny little issuance, at that time, transition meant to finance something that was not green. Now, fast forward to today, we now have that development of the concept of transition. Investors now are developing their own methodologies, and they're integrating transition into their investment decisions. Now, they are using guidance and recommendations for the likes of ICMA to sort of build their own methodologies and understand how they should start measuring and support the transition path. And so in that process, investors now understand that transition is everything, not just something that is, not something that is non-green, but also green investments and financing of green is part of that transition. Not even the solar and wind energies are free from emissions in their supply chain, right? So everything is part of that transition, and the market now understands that if we are to lower emissions and if we are to contribute to Paris Agreement goals, we do need that change in perception, and that is gradually changing. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam-san. Kida-san, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And I am from the Financial Services Agency of Japan, which is the, I would say, policymaker in financial sector, and also supervisors for the banks and insurers and the broker dealers in Japan. But well, as I said, as a kind of policymaker for the financial sector and financial markets, we've been involved with the development of climate transition finance guidance together with METI and the Ministry of the Environment so far. So with that capacity, I'm here. Well, if we look back the history of sustainable finance markets or green bond markets, I would say, I dare to say that those markets were a kind of financial market for fools. Because in many cases, that when investors invest in a green bond or certain sustainability-related products, they often rely on third parties or others to judge whether that products or bonds are green. So it is based on the kind of relinquishing the certain due diligence about greenness. So leave those judgments to others and judge whether those products are creditworthy or not is the sole responsibility of investors. When transition concept was introduced into that context, the landscape changed significantly, because transition, in order to judge whether that transition is genuine one, investors need to assess whether that certain entity have a credible climate targets and a credible plan for achieving those climate targets, and whether that entity set a certain credible pathway towards those goals. So there is an element of forward-lookingness, and there is an element of the judgment of certain kind of greenness. So that's the kind, I think, a kind of watershed moment for the sustainable finance market, and the confusion still continues. So in other words, I think climate transition concept changed the sustainable finance market in the way that, well, make investors embrace the elements of greenness as a kind of the one of the certain judgment elements for investing in something. So, for example, when investors invest in certain products, well, they will make a certain judgment about the prospect of the creditworthiness of the certain entity, or maybe investors would judge whether the certain technologies will deliver what that technology would promise. So all those things, in the end, need to be judged by investors. But when it comes to the judgment greenness, at least at the first phase of growth in the green bond market or sustainable finance market, those judgments were left with the third parties or others. So now we need to grow the markets of transition, but it requires a certain design of a certain ecosystem for facilitating that growth. For example, inevitably, there would be a certain uncertainties surrounding the transition, so that needs to be addressed. Of course, certain education for investors in terms of what technology would be effective for climate transition. And of course, there would be a certain kind of, disagreement over certain technology in terms of whether those technology would deliver the results for climate transition. So probably the judgment around the credibility of climate transition would not be necessarily unanimous. So there would be a certain differing opinions, but that is the normal thing in the financial market. At the end of the day, if everyone agrees on the valuation of a certain company, there would be no buy and sell. So that's the nature of the financial market. So I think the concept of climate transition is the force to kind of normalize sustainable finance market in the way that bring it closer to the normal function of the financial market. But that is why we need to address many things to grow transition finance market. So that is my observation. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much for your inputs. Transition finance, recent trends and developments and related organizations' activities, and gradually expanding transition capital markets. Even though there are divergences of opinions and could be confusions, those were mentioned. I guess that is happening because of the market being under development. As all of you mentioned, Japanese government, since February of this year, started issuing Japan climate transition bonds. We call this Japan Climate Transition Bond, or JCTB. So I would like to cover this JCTB as a topic for next round. So my question goes to Miriam. You say that I think Miriam-san, you are helping us in our IR activities for JCTB. So I would like you to talk about the feedback from the market.
Miriam-san, you have been joining the Japan team in the investors relation meetings and have been in the close dialogue with investors. So what are the main response you have received in the market participants about Japan climate transition plan?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I was very fortunate to be part of this very innovative way of talking about transition. And what I can say is that myself, I didn't know what was the approach of Japan at the beginning. And I have to say that it really opened my eyes, to this new way of looking at transition. And I guess investors in Europe saw the same. we had very positive responses for many reasons. But if I was to pick a few, I can say that investors were, first of all, very happy to see that Japan was going to focus on sectors, before even going into the hard to abate or high emitting sectors, sectors that are not the traditional ones that the green bonds from sovereigns had been focusing so far. So, for instance, transport or renewable energy. So they were going to address some of the comments that these investors themselves, some of the very sophisticated European investors had already pointed at. I do remember a few years ago, a couple of the very sophisticated asset managers in France were basically saying, if you actually finance specific sectors of the economy, the impact that you can have reducing those emissions is much higher if you go, directly to the high emitting sectors than if you go to the, renewables that now, not in the whole supply chain, but definitely there are zero emissions in the production of the energy. So they were very, very happy to see that Japan was addressing the elephant in the room. So by doing that, they were saying the impact is much larger, number one. Then we see the additionality of not being focusing on transport or renewable energy. And so they were basically very on board with the innovative approach. And at the same time, Japan was using R&D as well, to promote investments in these, promoting technologies that really need support in order to become more competitive. So all of that, is the same story as we saw with the electrical vehicles across the globe, right? A few years back, car makers couldn't, fathom the idea of having electrical vehicles. And now every car maker on the planet has several models, right? And, only a few years back, they were saying, it's impossible, we can't do it. And now it's a reality because investment poured into that sector. So now is the next step, which is not, we're going to take that. I remember, I also remember when the first few green bonds started and the market was really tiny, that we used to track the cost of wind and solar until one day it became cheaper, than coal, right? So that is that innovative approach of Japan, saying we are actually going to invest in these sectors, and that's what the investors saw. And in Europe, they were very, very happy with that approach. So generally, the response was very, very positive.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Mustak and Mr. Ikeda, I would like to ask you a question about the discussions or exchange of opinions from the market participants as to the response regarding the Japanese climate transition bond issued by Japan.
Mr. and Ikeda-san, how was JCTB has received in your exchanges of opinions with capital market participants? Mr. please.
Yes, thank you, Tajiri-san. And it's very interesting to listen to Miriam. I wish I could have been there in those investor meetings. That would have been super interesting. But I did have the privilege of speaking with many investors as part of my role at ICMA. And perhaps I can speak a bit more generally because when I talk about ICMA, I'm not talking about a small number of people in a room who are my colleagues. What I mean is the whole principles, green and social bond principles community, which is over 400 stakeholders in the global market, including banks, investors, NGOs, government officials, and service providers, external reviewers, law firms, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the stakeholders that I'm in contact with, so I can give some very general observations. I think the Japan Sovereign Transition Bond was well-timed because it came at a, as Ikeda-san said, a real watershed moment in the history of sustainable finance and transition finance. I think since 2020 going to 2023, 2024, there have been, I would identify two major shifts in the overall consensus thinking of the market. First of all, I think there was a realization that despite the exponential and very promising growth in the size of the ESG-labeled bond market, as Miriam's slide very clearly pointed out, think about it, still 10.8% of overall bond issuance, and that's quite small, right? We still have so much more investment that's required to fund the need for transition of the entire world economy to sustainability and to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And even that 10% is just not going to be enough by most estimates. So it was understood that there need to be other channels to fund the transition, not just the straight green bond market. The second shift, I think, is that this is more maybe philosophical and conceptual, but the market had become, again, as Miriam said, more sophisticated, especially the investors. It had gone from an analysis of sustainable finance, which looks at whether something is green or not. Does it fit in this category? Does it not fit in this category? Is it acceptable? Is it moral? Is it good? Is it bad? Right? This kind of point of view to a more pragmatic point of view where you're looking at how much is this helping? How much is this reducing emissions? How far is this taking us towards our goals? And that's a very fundamental but subtle shift. And I think that also lends itself much better to the idea of transition finance, where investors, instead of saying, does this fit in the right bucket? Is this something that I like or don't like? It's really looking at it more closely. It's becoming much more exact, much more detailed. And it's harder work, but it's actually more fruitful and more accurate to think about how far you are getting along that path. And to this end, to get to the actual question, the market, I think, generally received the the transition sovereign bond from Japan quite well, and in some ways better than expected. I think there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, there had been some skepticism about transition finance in general from some parts of the stakeholder community. And the reason was that they weren't sure whether this is a form of just trying to get not green investments in and call them green, right? But the disclosure and the transition framework of the Japanese government was very robust, very honest, very complete, had great governance in it. It was extremely clear and honest about what the roadmap was going to be like and what the potential investments would be like. And so, as Ikeda-san mentioned, it allowed investors to make their own decisions and their own analyses. So maybe 100% of investors didn't think it was ambitious enough, or they may have disagreed with some of the use of proceeds. But many investors were also very pleased to see that it was aligned with their views and their more sophisticated analysis of what was valid transition and what were the right pathways to go along. So the level of disclosure and the transparency was extremely important, I think, in making the transaction a success. And the other thing is that for this inaugural one, I've actually heard from at least one stakeholder who will remain anonymous, who told me that, well, actually, it's really a green bond because the use of proceeds for the first bond actually did not really cover many of the more controversial sectors and quasi-fossil fuel sectors. I think the Japanese government was quite careful to ensure that the use of proceeds was really as green and uncontroversial as possible, which I think went a long way to assuring the market and ensuring acceptance of this first one. Now we'll see as time goes by what the proceeds of future issuances are, whether the market will be more accepting of those. But I believe that this first issuance showed incredible amount of good faith, an incredible amount of very good, clear transparency, and gave great credibility to the Japanese government as issuer. And one more, I think, enormous benefit from ICMA's point of view is that on two different levels, it showed that transition bonds can be successfully implemented. So this is a great example not only for corporates around the world who are looking at transition finance, but also other governments who may have an interest in transition finance as part of their overall energy policy.
Kida-san, please.
Okay, well, I'm a part of the government, so too much about flattering the issuance is not may not be well received, but I would say building on what Mushtak-san spoke about. When it comes to the climate transition, it requires certain forward-looking judgment by the investors. So to support those forward-looking judgment by investors, we often now talk about the transition plans. And when transition plans are produced by individual companies, now people realize that the solo transition plan by a real sector company would not be sufficient for investors to judge the credibility of that transition plan, because there is a certain question of whether those plans will be well financed by the financial sector, and actually for the certain transition pathways involve certain kind of dependencies between sectors and between certain policies. So now people realize that there needs to be a 3 level of transition plan. Transition plan by a real sector company, transition plan by the financial sector, and transition plan by government. And in that context, I understand that the issuance of climate transition bond by the Japanese government was well received because, as Mushtak-san spoke about, it accompanied the very detailed plan for climate transition by the Japanese government. So certainly it qualified as a kind of a government level transition plan in the eyes of the investors. So in that sense, I would say that the issuance of a sovereign climate transition bond was a success, if I may say so, because it certainly attracted the attention by global investors to the GX plan put forward by the Japanese government, which include a 150 trillion yen investment plan and 20 trillion yen, of which will be financed by the Japanese government, and that is what the climate transition bond will finance. So in that sense, it certainly sends a good signal to the global investors, and I hope that with the expectation by global investors in place, the Japanese government will continue to enhance their commitments and their transparency in terms of how Japan and the Japanese government would deliver its committed goals vis-à-vis climate transition and climate targets.
ありがとうございます。日本のクライメートトランジションボンドについては、 パネリストの方の。
Thank you very much. Well, there were some lip services from the panelists towards the JTCB, but broadly, and I understand that it's favorably received. But as Mushtaq said, this was the first issuance, which was not very challenging. And he suggested that maybe we should be more challenging in the future. And although the understanding of this transition, climate transition bond is now spreading. However, there are some skepticisms in the community, and as Mushtaq said. So let's move on to the next topic. So how can we spread the transition finance going forward? As I said at the outset, how to abate sectors, not just in Japan, but in Asian countries. This is the area where the efforts are needed for decarbonization. So in that sense, investments in such sectors for decarbonization, there is a great demand for that. As Miriam said, although broadly, the sustainable finance itself is growing, but not so for the transition finance itself. So what are the main points for us to further grow the transition finance in the future? So this is the question that I would like to ask on all of you. So starting with Miriam. So in order to promote the transition finance, what are the roles that the governments can play? And then, of course, the governments themselves can issue the bonds, thereby raising the level of reliability.
Finance, please.
Yes, I guess this has been hinted throughout the panel and also mentioned in the panel before this one. So governments have a very, very specific role when it comes to sustainable finance and specifically in transition finance. They have the powerful tool of government budgets, and they can use the money, they can focus the money in specific sectors of the economy that can transform the economy. They have the power to transform the economy. How? By using tax subsidies and investments to shift from one economic activity to another one, making that one the focus and ensuring that that activity can become competitive. What we just mentioned in how wind and solar became cheaper than coal at some point. That happens when investment moves. Now, governments have that power of attracting private investment by saying, we are going to help this sector of the economy. So you can come in as a private investor, as an entrepreneur, as an SME, you can come in because there will be rewards to reap here. So that's how you crowd in private money, and that's how it happens, right? So that's really the role of the public sector, which I believe Japan has taken one step further, because there is another role, the role of leadership. And in here, Japan has done that magnificent job of educating, because they didn't go and, I think, to Europe just to get all those investors to buy the bond. They actually went to educate the market. They want everyone to know that it's possible if we all contribute and if we all help move this forward. And the innovation didn't just come from focusing in those hard to abate sectors, but also in how they're doing it. I think everyone is looking for that impact report. Investors will be very much focusing on how the story is told 1 year after, or whenever that impact report is available, they are expecting that same level of transparency and the story to be carried on. But yeah, I guess that's the role of governments. Make those sectors more competitive, bring in the private investment, and contribute that way to lower emissions in a very impactful way, as we were saying earlier, because you are addressing, the high-emitting sectors, so you are being more efficient, more effective by lowering those emissions, more. And I guess that's contributing to, changing the story of transition, right? Like that's part of the history as well. Moving all the way from transition, a bad word understood as something that is really not green, to now transition being part of every investment in green. That's why the first, GX bond may have been confused with a green bond, because yes, you do need to gently ease into the, ease the market into it. But any green bond is part of that transition, and so Japan is going to show us how they're going to do it. And so you move all the way along to basically saying transition is part of a broader strategy, and the focus of that strategy is to really achieve those, Paris goals.
Thank you. 次はじゃあ池田さんに
Next, maybe I can turn to Ikeda-san. Transition finance, especially deployment into Asian market, may find a lot of demand for transition finance. So JFSA probably is working on transition finance propagation in Asia. So maybe I would like you to talk about government role in so doing.
Well, again, in collaboration with METI, FSA Japan, have made certain efforts in establishing the concept of transition in Asian financial markets. And in that context, we made a certain official launch of the Asia GX Consortium earlier this month. The consortium is joined by, the ASEAN authorities and also ADB, together with the Japanese private financial institution, and also JBIC and JICA and DBJ. So we have come together to promote the concept of transition finance in Asia, so that we can showcase actual cases for transition finance, because we talk a lot about the transition finance as a matter of policy, but actual cases are still scarce. So, leveraging what we have done in Japan, and also leveraging on what ASEAN has done vis-a-vis transition, for example, their transition taxonomies or guidelines on transition finance. We hope to produce a certain kind of a judgment framework for transition finance, and establishing a certain modus operandi for actually delivering the transition finance to what really needed. as I said repeatedly in this panel, the judgment of the credibility of climate transition requires certain complex and nuanced decisions. And well, particularly as well, certain emerging economies may not necessarily commit to the 1.5 degrees Celsius climate target. Or they do commit to the below 2 degrees Celsius target, but not necessarily 1.5. So it is often the case that many transition finance related framework for judging the credibility of transition pathway and so on and so forth have been built on the premise that, well, everyone will seek 1.5 degrees Celsius target. But so that is why it is sometimes difficult for some emerging economies or some entities in the emerging economy to apply those frameworks to their actual cases. So how to fill that gap with a certain credible tools is critically important. And if I may add, increasingly scientific evidence indicate that 1.5 degrees Celsius target is becoming more and more difficult to achieve. So if we look at wider perspective, that kind of discussion is probably will become relevant with advanced economies as well. But at least right now, when we judge the credibility of transition finance in the context of emerging economies, what would be the credible framework to produce actual cases is the most urgent and pressing topic. And we hope that we can advance that agenda within the Asia GX Consortium and also the Asia Zero Emission Community or AZEC context.
Thank you. Now turning to Mushtaq. From your perspective, what more is needed to further promote transition finance, especially in this Asia-Pacific region?
To further promote transition finance, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, please.
Sure, thank you. So I've been inspired actually a bit by the other panelists. So let me answer this on perhaps three levels. The first is at the government official sector policy level, where both Miriam-san and Ikeda-san have answered quite eloquently already. I'll just add that from ICMA's perspective, we see that the official sector support is extremely important and has been more helpful than anyone would have expected at the start of the sustainable finance market. In addition to some of the tools that have been mentioned already, in particular sovereign issuance, which I think is hugely important, sovereign investment is also another very important and influential tool. Sovereign wealth funds, for example, investing in transition finance. Sovereigns providing loan guarantees and other official sector assistance in order to facilitate investment in transition finance. More broadly speaking, of course, it's all about overall energy strategy and overall energy policy, the budget. That is absolutely crucial because the financial industry is going to follow where the money is going, right? The financial industry will not itself make its own decisions on allocation. It will be based on the overall preferences of the real economy. So in Japan, I think we already see that it's happening very well. The transition plan is extremely clear. but certainly other countries can possibly do better in this respect. There are other tools also that can be used to help encourage the transition finance market, just in the same way that governments can help to encourage and promote the green and social bond, sustainable bond market, such as grants to issuers, such as technical assistance. Some countries, some governments have preferential treatment of central bank facilities, for example. There are fast-track approvals for green bonds under securities law. So there are quite a number of different sorts of tools and levers and incentives that can be used by governments to promote all kinds of sustainable finance. And sorry, if I just may give a quick plug, we have a paper from ICMA, which was issued earlier this year in 2024 on transition finance, with quite a bit of discussion about some of the official sector tools that can be used to promote transition finance. Now, the second level that I would mention are, again, tools, but tools at the industry level or at the market level. So one aspect of this would be taxonomies. Another aspect would be roadmaps. I think there's been a great amount of progress done over the last 3 to 4 years in this respect, especially in Japan, but there's still more work to be done because frankly, we talk about Japan where I think it's certainly more advanced, the technical work on transition, but in other parts of the world, in other emerging economies, there's still a long way to go before you have country-specific transition pathways, country-specific transition pathways that can be translated into sectoral pathways that can actually be used as the basis for corporate transition pathways. So I think that work will be ongoing. And then also in terms of tools, ICMA, we're trying to do our part to help promote different products and different ways in which to channel transition finance into, channel investments into transition finance. Two things I'll mention that were just released this year. One is guidance on green enabling projects, which are projects that are not inherently green in themselves, but which can be used as a basis for getting and enabling more green projects. And these are actually additional categories under the green bond principles that can be supported by additional evidence. But you can also look at these quote unquote as transition style projects. Another one, a set of guidance that ICMA just issued is on sustainability linked financing bonds. I'm not getting that right. But these are basically bonds that are used to finance sustainability linked loan bonds. That's right. They're sustainability bonds that are helping to finance sustainability linked loans. And I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but again, this is another tool that can help to promote transition finance. The final point I'll make, I'm sorry, just a bit behind, but I think perhaps the most important level on which work needs to be done to improve the credibility of overall transition finance is to demonstrate the benefits of transition finance through accurate impact measurement and reporting. This, if it works, if you can show that transition finance and these investments are actually providing a measurable benefit to sustainability, to a measurable reduction in greenhouse gases, that will probably go a very long way to dispel any remaining doubts about the credibility and efficacy of transition finance. Thank you, and sorry I went over.
ありがとうございます。じゃあ、お時間もおわずかとなります。
Thank you very much. So it's time for us to wrap up this session. The transition finance concept and the importance has spread globally over the past few years. I'm sure the panelists agree on it. And as the panelists mentioned, ICMA and other international bodies have released relevant guidelines, and various entities, including the Japanese government and various companies, have been issuing transition bonds, thereby spreading this transition finance further. And this is not to brag, but it seems that the Japan's climate transition bonds have been received well globally, as our panelists mentioned, and contributing to raising awareness of transition finance, I believe. However, when it comes to the concept and the importance are okay, but when it comes to details of what transition is or how it should be, there are differences in opinion about the definitions and which are to be covered in the transition finance. And there are some negative comments that we often hear about those. And as Mushtaq pointed out, about the Japan's CDB. But the first issuance was okay. But when it comes to the second issuance, which may invest in the ammonia co-firing and fossil fuels, and that may be received less favorably. So with that point in mind too, on how we can spread the transition finance further is one issue. And then the companies may develop a transition plan and explain about that to stakeholders. But as our panelists pointed out, the government's committing support to such companies will raise their level of credibility. And Miriam said that the public sector, such as Japanese government, by doing that, that will lead to the further private investments coming in and will help increase the level of transparency. And then Mr. Ikeda talked about Japanese government's policies and actions, and I'm part of the Japanese government, so I thought that these are the points that we should have in mind in furthering our actions in the future. The transition finance is still in its nascent stage. And in order to raise the reliability, as Mushtaq pointed out, disclosure and reporting are very important, and how we can show that the GHG emission reduction is made possible through the transition finance. And if we can demonstrate that, that will be able to raise the reliability of the transition finance, which is an important point. So we have identified these challenges, and people who are in this audience, and also the people in the business world, and also those of us who are working in the government, we should closely collaborate in the public-private partnership as well as in the international collaboration, so that we can steadily come up with the very robust cases of transition finances. And I would like to ask for your further cooperation and understanding about the transition finance. And with that note, I'd like to close this session. So please give them a big round of applause to all the panelists in our session.
Thank you very much.